Hi everyone, my name is Marissa Wall, and I want to talk to you a little bit about ADD and ADHD today. So first, the introduction. Why study ADD and ADHD? As I talked about in my paper, there are actually a few other topics that interested me a little bit more by their actual content, but I felt that this subject would be most relevant because I'm seeing more and more in my classes, in my public school that I work at, that often 4 to 5 kids in each class are diagnosed with ADD and ADHD by 4th grade. So I felt that this was an important topic to be able to discover ways in which I could help my students and to just understand the matter a little bit more so that I could talk to parents and just feel more educated on the topic. So first, to talk about what ADD and ADHD are, it's actually interesting because I found that this is actually quite a controversial topic. So some people just don't believe that ADD and ADHD even exist. And it is worth noting that we are the country that seems to focus on this matter more than any other. And part of that might have to do with our expectations. That being said, this has been a subject matter that's been studied quite a bit, and the aspects or symptoms that ADD and ADHD tend to carry together are difficulty paying attention, impulsive talking, lack of patience, and then along with that, I think ADHD is really a little bit more notable for hyperactivity. So that's that H. So it's attention deficit disorder is ADD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is that ADHD. And where we see this hyperactivity has to do with fidgeting and with constant movement, and sort of that feeling of inability to be able to control one's impulses. I liked this image here because when I searched the word ADHD, it showed all of these positive words as well. Creative, inspired, motivated, intuitive, positive. And so this also, this image also shows that, of course, these are the negative symptoms, but there can be really positive attributes that children with ADHD can really display in the classroom and in their personal lives. And it's important for us to not just focus on the negatives, but also the positives. You know, what is it that this disorder can bring to the classroom? How can I use this energy to be able to fuel my lessons? So to talk a little bit about ADHD in the brain and ADD in the brain, we need to remember that the brain is an organ that controls thinking, feeling, and behavior. So these key differences between children who are diagnosed with ADD and ADHD and those who are not are mainly the size of some of their brain lobes. So in particular, we find that the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that helps people organize, plan, pay attention, and make decisions, is particularly affected by these disorders. So parts of the frontal lobe may mature a few years later in people with ADD and ADHD. So this implication basically means that their emotional and their thinking abilities might really be quite a few years farther back than their peers. So maybe if you're working with a 4th grader that has ADD or ADHD, he might have that emotional or mental maturity of more like a 2nd grader. So that's really important to keep in mind, that sometimes it's not necessarily the choices they're making, but their actual specific level of development at that moment. So there are also implications that this disorder affects the brain's networks. Now, what we mean by networks, I took this quote from aacp.org, that the brain is made up of nerve cells called neurons that transmit signals in the brain. Signal levels through the brain are in groups of nerve cells called networks. So these networks are really what's passing the information from one part of the brain to the next. So researchers identified several major networks that work differently in people with ADHD. These networks are involved in reward, focus, paying attention, shifting between tasks, and movement. So keeping in mind these different aspects, you can kind of think, maybe every year when you get your new classroom and you see which IEPs your students have, you can think, okay, so I know that these 4 boys and this 1 girl have ADD and ADHD. What are going to be the challenges that they might encounter with our everyday tasks? So if you think of things like reward, focus, and paying attention, you can also consider, okay, what is it that I can do in order to help these students so that they don't get caught in transitions, for example, that might be really challenging for them. So kind of thinking creatively and trying to think of ways that you can sort of front load a task or anticipate a challenge and see if you can find specific activities or modifications for these students that can help them get through their day a little bit easier so that you might not have these same behavioral problems that you could anticipate with students with ADD or ADHD. Another implication is, while scientists have shown that there are differences in the brain size, networks, and neurotransmitters, the brain development of children with ADHD, they do not fully understand how these differences lead to the cause and the symptoms of ADD and ADHD. So this is important to notice because although, in the past 30 years, this has been a very widely studied topic, we don't have all of the answers. So, we can note these symptoms and we can try to figure out what it is to help them, but we need to understand that this isn't kind of forever developing topic, and that we need to be open to new ideas in the field and also maybe consider some of the older practices as older practices. So it says treatments for ADHD are thought to work in part by altering the levels of neurotransmitters and changing how the networks function. So treatments, this is sort of talking more about medication, which once again is quite a controversial issue. But this is kind of how they work in order to work on the levels of the brain with neurotransmitters and how these networks are functioning together in order to make their brain communication kind of on the same level as their peers who might not have ADD and ADHD. So how these challenges relate to learning really has to do, I think in part, with how we help our children. So we essentially need to remember that these challenges can prove problematic for students in basically every aspect of school. So this can be from lining up to music class, to following the rules, to playing foursquare recess, to raising their hand in the classroom. So I think that means that we as educators, as well as parents and physicians, need to educate ourselves on how we can best aid these students. So I think it's also notable that it's not necessarily these students are bad, it's not that they're just rebellious or they're just doing these things to bother you or to get a rise out of you. I think we need to remember that they're not culpable for the inner workings of their brain. So what that means for us as educators is that they will have more challenges in the classroom, and that we need to take a deep breath and ask ourselves what we can do to allow them to make it to their finish line. And by that I mean, this isn't the same finish line maybe as their peers, but we need to think about their individualized goals. And this can be how, no matter how small or how large they are, just really working with that student as an individual instead of constantly comparing them to their peers. One image I liked is this one at the right. It says ADHD therapy works best when you keep scheduled appointments, talk to the therapist about what's going on with your children, and help your child practice at home. So another important thing is, if you do have a student that's diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, is really having a plan, have that IEP, and focus on their specific goals, but not just academic goals, also behavioral goals, goals, social goals with friends, and tracking them. Oftentimes students with ADD and ADHD do really well with a lot of structure because it doesn't allow for as much of the chaos to be happening. So basically creating a plan. Now the application to the classroom, I found a few different tools that I really liked, and two of them are recognized here. So one they have is these exercise balls, and these are basically a form of alternative seating. So, with these students specifically with ADHD, with that hyperactive disorder, it allows them to always be moving. And so they're not just sitting there in class, feeling like they have to be moving, bothering the person next to them. If they get this ability to bounce and move a bit, it can really allow them to get out some of that excess energy without acting up in class. This stool to the right, I think they call it a swivel in my district, has also been used a lot with students. It allows that same ability to be moving without really bothering others next to them. And I found an additional tool that I liked a lot. It says 16 awesome flexible seating classrooms that will blow your teacher's mind. So this is from Board Teachers, and it's an awesome website. It gives you so many different ideas of how to set up your classroom and what you can do. An additional tool that I found is called the Lazy 8 breathing method. And this is one that I found a friend of mine used with her daughter. And the child's supposed to take their finger and they trace this 8. You know, they start here and then they breathe in for 8 seconds and then they breathe out for 8 seconds. And they continue to trace this in order to get that sort of meditation in of breathing in and breathing out. So in conclusion, I think that it's really important for us as educators to understand what ADD is and what ADHD is and what we can do to aid our students. This is also important because, you know, you're very likely to have students that are diagnosed with these disorders, and it's important for us to be able to communicate with their families and with their doctors and, you know, the school counselor to be able to make educated decisions on how we can help them and what their individualized plan is. All right, thank you very much.